This video is brought to you by Captivating History. In the 21st century, when we think of the United States of America, we think of a superpower. America has seen a steady rise throughout the centuries, but its humble beginnings lay under the stern hand of the British Empire. Before America could rise as the purveyor of freedom and liberty, it had to earn its own. In the words of Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty or give me death." The British Empire was a behemoth of its era. Their colonial policies had seen them expand from Europe to Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Going against them was by no means an easy task. But the British colonists in North America did. The rebellion marked the birth of the United States and signified a crucial point in history because it was one of the first modern nations that were founded on the principles of individual freedoms, rights, and libertarian beliefs. America, in the late 18th century, and a few years later France, after the French Revolution, became the first two modern constitutional republics. It was the beginning of a new era, where feudalism would be outlawed and individual merit would be cherished above all else. It was an outlier when compared to the Western powers of its time, when monarchies ruled the kingdoms and subjects had to bow down to the upper hand. The 18th century and its political operations may seem like a lifetime ago, which they are, but they continue to shape contemporary political discourse and social debate. For anyone interested in modern Western political thought, the revolt of the 13 colonies in the American Revolutionary War is a major point of interest. The story of the American Revolution is one of colonial mismanagement, the pressure of mounting external forces, and the courage and dedication of a group of individualists who had the discipline to unify under a common banner. How did the American Revolution, or the American Revolutionary War, come about? What are the causes and reasons behind it? To understand the reasons why the American Revolutionary War took place, one must go back to the beginning. Although the Vikings had established a presence in Newfoundland in modern-day Canada in 1000 CE, the European settlement of the Americas truly began with Christopher Columbus's discovery of the New World. Europeans unknowingly spread diseases to the natives, whose immune system could not fight them off. On top of this, the Europeans enslaved and conquered many natives throughout the early centuries of the Age of Discovery, contributing to what we today call the genocide of the indigenous people of the Americas. The Spanish ended up colonizing Central America and most of South America. The Portuguese took over Brazil. In the 16th century, when the Spanish were draining the new continent of its resources, pirates started looting them. An English sailor named Sir Francis Drake started looting the Spanish Navy and kept sending the rewards to Queen Elizabeth I. By the 17th century, Spanish naval supremacy had started to wane. The maritime powers of the Netherlands and Britain acted as catalysts for its decline. The Dutch and the British established colonies in the Caribbean and North America. Other European powers, such as France, Sweden, and Denmark, followed their example and established colonies. But none of them had access to the lucrative natural resources in Mexico and Peru except Spain. Their workaround for this inconvenience was to grow cash crops and provide them to Africa in exchange for slaves. Britain's wars with the French and the Dutch started to spill over into North America. The British had their fair share of troubles, as engagements with the native populations and competition with their European rivals kept them alert and vigilant. For instance, New York was originally a Dutch colony that the British seized. They got rid of the Dutch, but the French were far more stubborn. They had laid claim to the Louisiana Territory, and the Spanish had a foothold in Florida. Initially, the British settlement in North America was largely restricted to the eastern seaboard, from Massachusetts to Georgia. But from the early 1600s to the 1730s, they managed to establish 13 colonies. The British colonies did not identify as a collective, singular unit. For the most part, they identified with the colonies in which they lived and were loyal subjects of the British monarchy. The British possessions in North America could be divided into three groups. 1. New England, which included the colonies of New Hampshire, Massachusetts Bay, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. 2. The Middle Colonies, which included the states of New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. 3. The Southern Colonies, which included Virginia, Maryland, North and South Carolina, and Georgia. The Southern colonies had a largely agricultural economy. The lack of European manpower meant that slaves did most of the work. Small-scale revolts did take place and usually ended without making any difference. The climate of New England was not conducive to cash crops, so they had an industrial economic base. As immigrants continued to pour in, the 13 colonies started to differ in religious and racial identities, as well as economic and political structures. In the mid-18th century, Austria, France, and Russia declared war on Frederick II when he redrew the map of Europe with his expansionist aims. Since Prussia had an ally in Great Britain, tensions between the New World colonies were about to rise. Thus began the 7 Years' War, later described by Winston Churchill as the First World War. The 7 Years' War was the Anglo-French struggle to gain control of not only the Americas, but Asia and Africa as well. It was a war across 5 continents, and Britain, known for its naval superiority, started to attack French colonies overseas to distract them from the European theater. The two sides engaged in conflict in North America in 1754, in what is known as the French and Indian War, when a young George Washington, coming back from a mission as an envoy, got involved in a skirmish with a French encampment. The 7 Years' War, which actually lasted for less than 7 years, officially ended with the Treaty of Paris, which awarded most of French Canada and Spanish Florida to the British, with the Spanish gaining French Louisiana. The war ended France's presence as a major land power. The British Empire had helped the American colonies in the war, but the help was not free. Starting from 1764, the British Empire started taking a keen interest in the inner workings of the colonies. Their desire to take a more active role in the colonies would yield disastrous results for them. The British had won the 7 Years' War, but their lax and dismissive attitude towards North America caught up to them. Britain stationed 10,000 troops in North America to enforce its will in the colonies and decided to tax the American colonies to pay for the soldiers. There was justifiable anger and opposition from the colonies. The war had brought the colonies together, and they knew a threat when they saw one. To them, the British were trying to undermine and dictate to the colonies. Before the 1760s, the colonies had been quite autonomous, as salutatory neglect allowed them to go about their business as long as the British knew about it. But this policy of subjugation was introduced, and everyone in the colonies knew what the future would bring if it were allowed to carry on. The taxes kept coming. First, the British introduced the Sugar Act, which pertained to custom duties and saw backlash from New England. But when the British introduced the Stamp Act, all hell broke loose. The colonies wanted to levy taxes through colonial assemblies without the British hovering over them. The Stamp Act was perhaps the most contested item of legislation in the history of British rule in America. The colonies did not have representation in Parliament, so they could not contest the decision. Protests started emerging in the colonies. No taxation without representation became a popular slogan. The scope and ferocity of the protests caught everyone off guard. As the pressure kept mounting, Parliament had no choice but to re-examine the legislation. The government moved to repeal the Stamp Act, stating that unnecessary provocation on this account would turn the rebellion into a revolution. On the other hand, they introduced the Declaratory Act, which declared the government's ability to tax the colonies in any case whatsoever. The initial reaction? Jubilee. But the euphoria soon gave way to despair as the colonists started to consider the implications of the Declaratory Act. The Revenue Act, one of the Townshend Acts, was passed by the British government, which only added fuel to the fire. The act imposed custom duties on several goods like glass, paper, and tea. All of this led to protests in North America, particularly in Boston. The Sons of Liberty, a group formed in 1765 to counter the British threat, spread throughout the colonies, which had Samuel Adams and John Hancock as prominent leaders. The group was mainly involved in protests in New York and Boston, and extra British troops were sent to the latter city to maintain order and stability. Tensions between the soldiers and the protesters reached a climax when 8 infantrymen fired and killed 5 people in March 1770. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre, and it strengthened colonial resolve against the British. In 1773, the British tried to implement a new tax on tea. To protest the measure, people headed to Boston Harbor and started dumping tea into the water. Once again, the Sons of Liberty were highly involved in the incident. The press and media called the incident the Boston Tea Party. Instead of backing off and trying to defuse the tense situation, the British decided to play hardball, issuing several new laws that the colonists dubbed the Intolerable Acts. In 1774, representatives of 12 colonies met at the First Continental Congress to discuss a united response. The delegation from Massachusetts proposed an end to all trade, but the middle and southern colonies did not like the hostile approach. In Boston, things were particularly bad. Earlier that year, British ships had blockaded the Boston harbor as a response to the Boston Tea Party. Having attempted to enforce the Intolerable Acts, the governor of Boston finally dissolved the Massachusetts Provincial Assembly that October. The assembly did not comply willingly. It relocated outside the city and named themselves the Provisional Congress. The governor faced open rebellion and requested reinforcements that never arrived. The British wanted to confront the colonists sooner rather than later, but did not feel the need to send reinforcements. After a few skirmishes, things escalated. In an engagement in Lexington, the British killed 8 militiamen and wounded 10, with the British suffering only 1 casualty. On the same day, a later confrontation in Concord yielded 273 casualties for the British and 95 for the Americans. The two sides, initially perceived as the proverbial David and Goliath, turned out to be pretty even on the battlefield. The news of the battles spread far and wide, starting the war that would lead to the eventual demise of the British Empire in North America. The Revolutionary War would finally end in 1783 with the signing of the Treaty of Paris. A new state would emerge and give rise to a radical constitution the likes of which the world had never seen. The ideas of the Enlightenment served as key points for the liberal democracy of America. The French liked the experiment and followed course in the next few years, albeit in a more brutal and radical manner. Slowly but surely, the rest of the world caught up as well, and the rest is history. Liberty must at all hazards be supported. We have a right to it, derived from our Maker. But if we had not, our fathers have earned and bought it for us at the expense of their ease, their estates, their pleasure, and their blood. John Adams. To learn more about the American Revolution, check out our book, The American Revolution, a captivating guide to the American Revolutionary War and the United States of America's struggle for independence from Great Britain. It's available as an ebook, paperback, and audiobook. Also, grab your free mythology bundle ebook while it's still available. All links are in the description. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos like this.